not just those of you who are here, although it is lovely to see people gathering together for events, but also a warm welcome to those of you who are joining us online. I know we've had quite a bit of Twitter traction about this particular event. This is going to be one of our last events actually as GMIT, and you know, while that might sound very sad, we're going to be like the caterpillar and the butterfly. Come Friday, we're going to be formally Atlantic Technological University in partnership with IT Sligo and Letterkenny IT. And the journey to becoming a technological university is one that probably started about a decade ago, but really accelerated in the last couple of years. You know, all credit to the pandemic, as a famous footballer might say, but it really allowed us to work very well together online and to be incredibly productive. Just as a former camogie player long ago, I would have played in an era which was before helmets came in, and you know, this is a topic that wouldn't have even occurred to us, and that is quite a good few years ago. But I just wanted to say that the importance of research in this area is just it's just huge, and really delighted to see this project getting underway. And as Lisa mentioned, it's been underway for some time, but also to emphasize the importance of engaging in the European aspect, developing European partnerships, and I suppose using the European vehicle for developing research activities and growing partnerships that will be sustained through other events and other initiatives. I just want to welcome some of our visiting speakers, Professor John Fairclough, Kevin Conahan, obviously to Lisa and to Ed, and a special thanks to Emma Finnegan for all the organising and really keeping us all on our toes. So just looking forward to seeing the outcomes of the project in due course. I'm coming in, as Lisa said, as new president on Friday. I've got to go home and write a few speeches now, so I'm not going to delay too long, but really wish you all the best this evening. Looking forward to maybe watching a Twitter thread maybe or two as the evening goes on, and I think as the project comes to a close later in the year, to really seeing strong outputs being disseminated. So best of luck to you all. Enjoy the evening, and go Margaret.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Des Foley. I'm Head of School of Science and Computing here in GMIT, and I'd like to add my welcome to Orla's there. Back in 2016, we embarked on the road of introducing sport and exercise into GMIT, and it's not that long ago when Lisa joined and we started out on that path. And today we have over 300 students studying in either sport, exercise, nutrition, undergraduate, postgraduate research level. And really what we wanted to do back at that time was to try and set out to be the best we could be for the west of Ireland in this particular area. There was a gap that we saw very, very early on, and Lisa really took it up and ran with it. And the rest of the team, many of whom are here this evening, have joined year on year. So that's as GMIT, and now the real excitement and potential is that we have colleagues in Sligo and in Letterkenny that we can join with, not just to be very good in the west of Ireland and nationally, but really to push on the international profile that this project is a really, really good example of. So I say we're really, really looking forward to that. The other really interesting thing about this evening is obviously a topic like this isn't just the reserve of scientists stuck in a lab or stuck in a computer. It's got a very, very important general interest to a huge population of people, whether in this country or internationally. And sometimes we as communicators, we're not the best scientists. So projects like this are really, really important for getting to the truth, having the arguments or the debates, and then trying to find the right medics, but for club coaches that are coaching at underage, so that is covering the whole spectrum. So that's why I think something like this is really, really important to start that dissemination process. So with that, I'll stop, and I wish everybody the best of luck for this evening. And I add my welcomes to Orla to Orla's, for those people that are here in the hall and for everybody watching online, whether in Ireland or overseas. I should say it's been 18 degrees in Galway today. It's been an absolutely fantastic day. So I hope you envy us here. Thanks very much indeed.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both Orla and Des for lending their support to tonight's event. But just to turn to tonight's event, so this project, we're very grateful that it was funded by the Erasmus Plus fund, which is a European fund which really helps people engage with different aspects of learning. And one of the things that hasn't really previously been funded through this call is a focus on sports concussion. And I suppose us as a partnership came together really as a group that absolutely love sport and want to ensure that sport is safe for all. So the partners on the project include ourselves, GMIT, who are the project lead, but also partners throughout the UK. We've got Oxford Brookes University, then also ICHIRF, which is the International Concussion Head and Injury Research Foundation, also SDU, Southern Denmark University, and then Trobe University coming from Australia as an associate partner to the project. The project is really focused not on elite sport, but looking after community sport. And I know from seeing the registrations that many of you that are here tonight and those that are online also come from that area where you're possibly involved in coaching teams, or you might be a parent of an athlete, you might be an aspiring athlete, and you're here because you want to know something about concussion. And that was really what the foundation for this whole project was about. How can we create resources and tools all in the area of sports concussion to create an awareness and training for this important area? The project focuses on developing outputs specifically for those that are learning how to coach sport or those that are teaching those involved in sport or sports coaching. And as a result of the project, there are a number of different outputs that you'll hear tonight, which are freely available from the Erasmus Plus website and will also be available from our own concussion website, which you'll see, thankfully, from the slide that Emma has put up behind me. So to kick off our night, we're going to have Professor sense of where concussion is today. And then we'll gradually go on to hear from Kevin, who's going to discuss one of the outputs as part of the project, the training guide, which is output 2, and how he's already begun to implement that in some of his research. Finished then by Ed Daly, who is another researcher here in GMIT, who'll be discussing output 1, which is kind of the evidence base behind some of the other aspects to the project. So to start off, I'd just like to introduce Professor John Fairclough, who has very kindly joined us from the UK. He's an honorary consultant orthopaedic surgeon and emeritus professor in sports and exercise medicine. He's been involved in the development of sports medicine and research in Wales and nationally, with specific involvement in Welsh Rugby Union at club and international level. John has a whole wealth of research behind him in the area of sports injuries. He's played an active role in the development of Progressive Rugby, which is a group that both myself and Ed are part of. And we're very much looking forward to his overview of concussion today and hearing about some of the work that he's been involved in. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming John to come and to open up our session. So thanks, John.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. It's the first time I've been this far to the east of Wales for a long, long time. I'm a member of a group called Progressive Rugby. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm dealing purely with rugby tonight, but we got together to look at concussion because, sorry, just next slide, let's see this. Next slide. Because we were noticing that many of our players who we'd known from the 1970s were starting to get problems. This is one of them. This is a man called Alex Popham. And I knew him when he was a player, and he started to develop early dementia. And that was not uncommon. So we started to look a little bit into it. And as a consequence, when you see Twitter and when you see the website, you'll see there's a lot of people both in rugby, in management, in physiotherapy, and in medicine. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to mention 3 films tonight. Not usual for an orthopedic surgeon, but they are Rollerball, they are Mr. Kawasaki, and then we'll come on to the other one in later. But this is a film called Rollerball. You can see here that in the 1970s, this film came out. But in the World Cup, I noticed there were a lot of increased injuries in rugby, and the times I referred to rugby as becoming like rollerball. And you can see what I mean. This was a sport which was played in the future, which was supposed to be the 2030s, where individuals were trying to get a ball from one part of the pitch to the other. And you can see this, despite the fact that there were rules, a head injury occurs. And as a consequence, there was an injury. Well, when you look at many of the things we see in rugby today, you see similar concussions. Now, as a consequence of the increasing number of concussions that were occurring in sport, what happened was that the government of the UK got a committee together, and a number of individuals got together to extract what evidence they had in the various different areas of sport. And Kieran Bracken and myself presented to this. The report came out earlier this year. But when we look at concussion in sport, the problem is we don't know the incidence. And the reason for that is because the surveillance of head injuries is very difficult. We don't know how many hours people play. We don't know what happens, what is classified as a concussion. But we do know that contact sports have a large number of head injuries producing concussion. So that's why we got together and formed this group, looking to see whether we could put some form of order and present, particularly to the World Rugby, our view of how rugby perhaps could be safer. And the reason for that is not because we're shroud wavers, but we are aware that in the past, various sports have been involved with concussion, and it's been a real problem. If you look at the bottom left of the screen, you'll see that there's a fight there. This is two boxers. One is Chris Eubank, the other is Watson. As a result of that fight, Watson had a very serious head injury, and it was found on litigation that there was a liability to the British Boxing Board of Control, and they were nearly bankrupted. At the top, you can see a paper, Clinical Evolution of Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy. And this was done approximately 8 years ago. And it was found that even in young people in American football, they were seeing changes in the brain. So concussion does seem to have changes which occur and which can be accumulative. And sorry, I'll just go back one slide. You notice at the bottom there, there's an Irishman, one of your best outside house, in fact, one of the best I've seen, Sexton. And look, he had 4 injuries in a very short time. And we have to question as to whether the brain can recover during that period. There is an author, Lewis Carroll, wrote a book, Alice Through the Looking Glass. And in one of the characters in there is called Humpty Dumpty. And he said, words mean what I want them to mean. And that's true of concussion, because each one of you sitting here will have your own view of what concussion is. Now, of course, it's got many different meanings, but look at the situation here. Top left-hand side, you'll see an injury. See the Everton goalkeeper being hit by, the Everton player hitting the Tottenham goalkeeper. Now, look what he says. The manager says he was in a bad way, but by the time it came around, he was wanting to stay on. He's a little dazed, but he's a lot better. Now, question yourself as to whether you think that man had a head injury which was sufficient to allow him to stay on. He then was challenged later on, and it was found that he probably was wrong. That's a football injury. So what is a concussion? Well, a concussion is when the brain moves inside the skull. Of course, it can be from an impact, and the brain turns round and can cause some significant changes. But it's not always an impact. I'm sorry, I am a medic. If you find this is a little bit difficult to watch, please turn away. But if you watch the impact here, can you see how that head whips backwards? And that's one of the things that occurs in some injuries. The brain is actually moving inside the skull. If you look at a cadaver, you can see that the cadaver itself, the skull is bigger than the brain, and the brain is in a C. So as the brain actually moves, it can damage these small blood vessels, but more importantly, inside the brain, there are little, almost like wires, very fine wires. These are the cells, these are the neurons. Now they get damaged. There is an alteration in their ability to actually communicate messages across. So when did they recover? The answer to that is we don't know, because we can't get inside. You can do animal experiments, but it's still unknown. Now, look at the left-hand side, and you can see a fight, and it's Khan falling to the floor, and watch him trying to get up. Now, this is a boxer trying to get up after being hit. As you can see, he's trying to get to his feet, but he falls over. Now, he was knocked out. Technical knockout, leaves the ring, can't box for 30 days. Now, look at this, only a few weeks ago, England v Wales. Look at the man lying on the ground, Thomas Francis. Remember the boxer, watch him try and get up. See, falls down. Now he stands up, rocks against the post. Now he puts his head in his hands. Now he's seen by an individual. He went back to play after head injury assessments. I'll let you understand. Again, if you don't want to watch, don't watch this. But here's a punch, which is hit, done in slow motion. Now watch the lips as this punch is hit. And what you will find is that the head moves, but remember the brain is inside that skull. And as it hit, the lips are moving forwards. Now that movement is occurring within the brain. So you're having that type of force applied to the cerebral tissue. Now, when individuals do get injured and they have a concussion, they fall to the ground, but it is their cognitive ability, their ability to actually make decisions which is altered. And you can see that here, the player is arguing in the last World Cup about whether he should come off. But the next day he says he's sorry. He didn't know where he was. It was because he was dizzy. But there is more than just the event themselves. There is some evidence that we can have a thing called second impact syndrome. Some people don't believe this, but certainly in my career, I have seen one individual, a 16-year-old Welsh boy who was injured in this way. But this is a Northern Irish child who died, and it was after having an injury early on in the game. Whether or not it was causative, we don't know. There wasn't enough. But it's certainly a risk. If you are concussed, you have a risk of having a second injury. But as a consequence of all this knowledge, my colleague is going to talk a little bit about concussion assessments later on. We have come with schemes to try and assess what is and is not safe, what is a concussion. And the head injury assessments, which you'll have heard so much about in the Six Nations, is a common thing that's done, as is the recovery, the return to play. But let's look at it in reality. This was, in fact, sorry if I can go back again. Can we play this? This is a game. Jamie Roberts is, in fact, a doctor. And what I ask you to do is to just watch this impact. Can you see the impact? Now they fall to the floor. One of those players fractures his skull. The other one goes off. The one with the fractured skull, which is Jamie Roberts, carries on playing the game. Now, what you have to ask yourself is, should we have had a mechanism by which he could have got off the pitch? Was the head injury assessment, which wasn't present then, would it have actually picked that up? As we've said, the trouble is that when you start asking players, they can't give you the straight answer, because once they're in a position that they've had a head injury, they make bad decisions. So why is a player allowed to play on? And any of you here are involved in sport, you know the situation. If you've had it yourself, you want to stay on. There is the problem, you might not recognize it, but sometimes it is quite obvious. If you don't recognize it, well, there should be in elite rugby somebody watching. In other sports, you've got to watch yourselves. It's the other players, it's the spectators who should also be a part of looking. There is a thing called the Goldman dilemma. It's again worthwhile looking at. There's some questioning about how how much veracity there is in this. But it was said that if you gave a tablet to a certain number of people and you guaranteed them a gold medal, would they actually take that tablet if it was going to kill them in 5 years? And about half of them said yes. Now, it has been challenged, but certainly my experience is that people do have a goal and they will get it at all costs. But it's the last one of those, which is the wish of the manager, which I think is the most important. And for all of you here, whether you're mums and dads or club individuals, the wanting to get on, the wanting to win, is something that gets into everybody. In the heat of the moment, you do not want that player to come off. If it was Johnny Wilkinson, the England-Australian game, just before the end and he got a head injury, would the doctor have taken him off? It's a very difficult situation. But the rule is, if you have a concussion, you shouldn't go on and play. And I feel very strongly that it is, the benefit must always be on the side of erring to caution. We do know when you look at scans which are taken late on, that there is abnormality. The problem is you can't do a CAT scan, an ME scan, an MRI scan, a PET scan on the day. So everything is always done later. But there is an interesting paper that has come out fairly recently. And this was looking at an MRI scan. And what an MRI scan is, it's not an anatomical scan. It's actually a water scan, because what happens is the magnet moves around and all the water molecules in the tissue point towards where the magnet is. Then you switch the magnet off, that's the clinking you hear. All the molecules fall back and it gives you a gradient map as the electricity or the electric charge comes up. And what we showed, it wasn't my paper, what they showed was that even at 3 weeks, the small number of people still had changes in the white matter. Although there were some changes and some recovery quite early on, at 3 weeks there was still some changes, and that's a worry, because it means there's no absolute save time. So I'm suggesting that the measurements that we take are always going to be an approximation. Very complicated slide, and please don't read it all, but what it does, it shows the journey that we've had in rugby union from the time when I was a young doctor in the early 70s, when we first started the 3-week rule. If you had a concussion, you couldn't go on for 3 weeks, you couldn't play for 3 weeks. The problem was that a lot of people cheated because they wanted to get banned. But they then started to go on to graduated return to play. And the problem was this was all mediated on a certain reliance on the Scat scan and the HIA were objective. We've always been very concerned about that in progressive rugby, because we do not believe that the brain can recover in 6 days and get them back to play. If you look at the natural history of concussion in the few papers we had, this one comes from Australia. And if you look at the two graphs, the blue line, on the side, the axis going up the side is the percentage of people. So the blue line is the percentage of people not playing. So as the line comes down, you can see that by 6 days, most people were back playing. But if you look at the red line is the recovery of the cognitive thought processes. So you can see that even though they've gone back to play at 6 days, at 6 days, they've still got some cognitive loss. So there is some measurable loss at that time they go back. And that by the time they're at 3 weeks, there's still some 17% change. Now, it's only one paper, but ask any teacher who's had a child what the maths is like at a few weeks, and you find that most children still have a mathematical problem several weeks after the injury. However, what we can say, the majority of people do get better. It's not a major problem for most people, but it does take longer in women and children. We're dealing with 90%, 98% of rugby specifically played in the amateur sports. It's in clubs and schools. And we do have a different return to play in the United Kingdom. It's 19 days for community before they go back, and it's 23 days for football, for the schools. Now, what I'd like you to do is, this is a schools game, and perhaps we can later on look at this, but what I'd like you to do is to just look at the young boy here, number 16, and what happens as the number 10 hits him. He hands him off. Now, he hits him in the head, but watch what happens to his head as he lands. So that's not the impact of the hand that's causing the problem, but the head. Now, just watch the other, as we let this run through, watch what happens. These are all the same age children. Okay? All right. Now, you've all been there. You've all seen this. So the question is how do you teach tackling to be safe on that child? Okay. Now, the women's game is also a problem, because the difficulty about women's rugby, especially in Wales, is women don't play rugby in schools. They tend to only play rugby at university, so they tend to pick up the game relatively later. And what we know of concussion in many sports, if you look at the sex ratio, is more women get concussed than men per incident games. In other words, you look at the hours played. I know one of my colleagues is going to talk about this later again, but there is a sex difference. Now, if we look at what happens here, again, can you see that that's a very, very similar situation if we just go back and watch again. As she's hit, it's the whiplash effect, and it's the head hitting the ground, because they don't have the stability in the neck muscles, because basically they didn't spend all the times in the lifting the weights in their early teens. And there is a huge risk factor there. At the elite level, we had a discussion with World Rugby about the return to play, and it was felt that it was safe to go back in earlier stages. We did have, we hope, some effect, and they did change the training and contact ratios, because obviously the more times you're impacted, the more times your brain is going to be likely to be injured. So the less contact training hours you have, the better. But again, I make no excuses for playing this again. Here we have a situation of a man. Now, what I would ask you is, each of you, you may not be medics, you may not be physiotherapists, is that man concussed? Now, let's have a look again at a similar situation. And what I would ask you to do is to just look at what he does here. Here you can see the man going to get the ball in a thing called a jackal. He's going to get the ball. But watch his head. He's going for the ball. He looks up and then he's hit. Again. He's going for the ball. He looks up and then he's hit. So he's getting a head injury because of the mechanism of the sport that he's playing. Now, rugby, and it's true of most of the sports, has seen a phenomenal change. Our rugby players have become bigger, and part of the problems I have is that we've actually started to substitute, and I cannot see the reason why we permit this many substitutes, because it means that people who are very big, bulky, who could not last 80 minutes, can now go on and only play 60 minutes. because there's been a 25% increase in momentum. Now that means that those impacts you're having are much greater than they ever were. And this is just a graph which demonstrates that since 1955 to 2015, you've had a gradual increase in body mass, but that is also associated not with bulk, but with pace as well. Now, can we measure concussion? Well, there's been lots of different attempts, and this is one of them at the moment, which is looking at instrumented gum shields. And there is also other measurements which are for microRNAs, but none of them have as yet been specific and given us enough information to say that this can specifically rule out a concussion. And of course, for children and for club rugby, these are very expensive and unlikely to be immediately available. So what's my conclusions? Well, a bit like Socrates, I know what I don't know. The concussion, it's a common injury, but we don't have a reliable marker. The symptoms and the variability for recovery is vast. Children and women are more at risk. We do need education. I think it's fantastic, Lisa, of you all here, to have this program, which actually allows us to show that there is a means of actually hopefully addressing this situation in the future. But we do need research, because if we don't get this right, we're all sports lovers and we're rugby union lovers, because if we don't reduce the number of concussions and the consequences of it, somebody will say it's too dangerous to play. Thank you very much indeed. Diolch yn fawr i nos da.
Thank you so much for that, John. I think that was a fantastic opening to the whole evening, just to give us a real understanding of the current state of play with concussion. I should have mentioned at the start that we will be having a Q&A with all of the speakers at the end, so we'll take questions at the end if that's okay. A few years ago, Des mentioned at the start that sport and exercise science wasn't here as an area of study a few years ago in GMIT, and it's been a fantastic initiative for us to be able to develop that and the nutrition programs that have aligned with it as well. And as part of that, we initiated the Irish Concussion Research Centre here a few years ago, and myself and Ed Daly, who's speaking later on this evening, co-founded that. And it's been a great development for us to be able to bring in a number of researchers who are looking at some of the topics that John mentioned. For instance, Ayrton Walsh, who's one of our current RISE scholars, is sitting in the back here, and he's doing an entire project which is focusing on concussion in women, looking at soccer and Gaelic football and rugby. And I'll just give him a quick shout out as well, because he's currently looking for participants. So if anybody's interested in taking part in that research, we'd be delighted to hear from you. But also, as part of that centre, we've been able to welcome Kevin Conahan to the ICRC, who has been researching concussion for the last few years, initially also as a RISE scholar and recently upgraded to a PhD studentship, and I think will be probably one of our first registrations as an Atlantic Technological University PhD student. And Kevin has done a lot of work on attitudes and behaviours in concussion across a whole host of different sports. So he's going to be discussing that tonight, and also as part of the Erasmus Plus project, he's been able to implement some of the early phase work that we did with the training guide. So I'd just like to welcome Kevin, who's, as I said, is a PhD researcher here at GMIT.
Hello everyone, my name is Kevin. I've been in GMIT for the last 3 years now, and my whole area of study is on concussion education, concussion awareness, knowledge and attitudes towards concussion. So over the last few years, I've worked with coaches, parents, an understanding of knowledge of their attitude. The reason for this is because you can use knowledge and attitudes to predict real world behaviors and hopefully be able to tools going forward What I mean by that is a person's ability to recognize signs and symptoms of a concussion, their ability to recognize how concussions occur, and as well as that, their ability to understand the recovery process of concussion. And then by concussion attitudes, this is how someone might react in a real world incidence of concussion occurring. So one of the questions that we might use for getting a measure of concussion attitudes with an athlete might be something like asking them how they would react, or if they had symptoms of a concussion like a headache and dizziness, and while they're still on the pitch, would they remain in play? Would they remove themselves from play? Or what decision would they make? And so here's just a quick overview of the work I've completed to date in GMIT. I'm going to briefly talk about the literature review and the animated video that we put together here. And then I'll talk a little bit more in depth about the focus groups, questionnaire and workshop. So I just want to kind of give a picture of what concussion is like in Ireland at the minute, what the knowledge levels are like, what the attitude levels are like in Ireland. So really briefly with the systematic literature review, I was examining studies that were testing the effectiveness of existing concussion educational programs and tools. So our initial searches, we had over 7,000 papers, and then we systematically brought this down to 25 studies that we included. So we found 25 studies that met our own criteria for educational materials. And the reason why we wanted to examine what these different studies looked at is so we could make our own educational tools going forward. And what we found is that the existing literature is very good at improving knowledge immediately post their interventions and long-term up to 6 months after their interventions. And then when it comes to attitudes, they're very good at increasing attitudes immediately post the interventions were carried out, but then they weren't very good at maintaining those higher levels of concussion attitudes after the increases from baseline. Other things we found as well is that these educational tools were mainly focused on athletes only. So other key decision makers in sport were really overlooked. There's not a whole lot of research on educational tools for coaches, for parents, for teachers. So that's something that we thought could do with being addressed. And then I'm going to move on to the animated video. So from the systematic literature review, we also found that there's a need and a place for accessible concussion educational tools. And we decided to go with this and to make our own accessible educational tool in the form of an animated video. So we have a few stills from the video up here on the screen. And then we put this video out and we got results back, got to see if it improved knowledge and attitudes. And we found that it increased both of them in the short term, but we don't have any long-term information to say if it's effective or not. But the positive thing about this is that the video is only 4.5 minutes long. You can watch it on your phone. So it could be implemented at key time points during a sports season. So if it's in pre-season or before an important run of games, so you can maintain your levels of concussion knowledge and attitudes that you on the video, and they felt that the time to watch the video was just right. So 86% of the people who watched the video felt that. And we also watched if people would be willing to rewatch the video again to maintain their gained knowledge and attitudes towards concussion. So 83% of participants were willing to rewatch the video, with only 2.3% saying that it wouldn't be worth their time again to watch. So again, this kind of, even though we don't know the long-term effects of the video, we found that most people would be willing to rewatch it to maintain higher levels of knowledge and attitudes. And you can find the video by going into YouTube and typing in "heads up concussion video," and it's the first result that's returned. We then went on to carry out questionnaires and focus groups with athletes, with coaches and parents across Ireland. So again, this is so we can design specific interventions for specific groups in Ireland, because different groups of people will have different needs. Our questionnaire, it managed to get out to just under 500 individuals, and it was a fairly even spread across the 3 groups. Everyone that filled it out was over the age of 18 and had some active involvement in sport in Ireland. So our main findings from the questionnaire was that coaches had the best knowledge of concussions. We also found out, it's supporting what a lot of us already probably feel, is that athletes showed the worst attitudes towards concussions, or the most dangerous attitudes towards concussions. So we also found out as well that attitudes tend to increase with age. So as you get older, your attitudes will improve. And we came up with a few recommendations from this questionnaire. So the first one is that our pitch side decision makers should be the ones deciding whether an athlete stays or is removed from the pitch. It should never, ever be left up to the athlete to decide to be removed from the pitch or to decide to stay on the pitch. Athletes tend to put the importance of the match ahead of their own welfare and will want to stay on the match with sort of a win at all costs mentality. So the second recommendation goes in line with that, that coaches and parents should be provided with more materials to actually make these pitch side decisions and to decide to bring the athletes off the pitch. So separate to the questionnaire, then we ran focus groups to kind of give us a more detailed, detailed aspect or detailed view of coaches, athletes and parents' knowledge and attitudes towards concussion. So we ran 4 separate focus groups. We ran one with coaches, one with athletes, 2 with athletes, so one with female athletes, one with male athletes, and then we ran one with our parents as well. And our main findings from this is that people find it really, really difficult to recognize concussion when it actually happens. And even when they do recognize it, people don't know what they're meant to do. So they don't know, am I meant to remove this player from the pitch? Is this player allowed to return? How long are they meant to stay off the pitch? It's not common knowledge to the people that took part. We also found out from athletes that they're willing to put their own will to win ahead of their own safety and the safety of their teammates. So here's a quote from one of our athletes that took part in our focus groups. So if it's a case where it's a key player who they might need for the next week or the week after that, I think it's the right decision to take them off the pitch. If it's a case that it's a big match, I think I might have a different answer for that. So this athlete was talking about some of their own teammates in a rugby situation where if it's not really an important match, it's okay for the player to come off the pitch. But if it's a semi-final or a final, I'd be willing to put that person's health at risk for the sake of winning a match. And these are the kind of dangerous attitudes that we want to highlight from athletes and why it's important for coaches and parents to come forward and to take that decision out of their hands. From a coach's perspective, coaches discuss an awful lot about how they just don't know what to do, even if you have an athlete who is really honest with you, will let you know if they're injured and will let you know how they're feeling. They just don't know how to actually spot a concussion. So we have supporting quotes from that as well. So even when you have a player who does share how they're feeling and not complaining straight away, how is a coach meant to recognize that? And then in our parent focus groups, they were talking about kind of the culture of Irish sports and that win at all costs mentality. And we have a quote here. So in the GAA, there's kind of a you'll be grand attitude about it. A lot of careers have been ended because of concussions, possibly because a player comes back too early. So we use all this information from our systematic review, our questionnaire, our focus groups, and it was really heavily influenced as well by output 2 from the Scat group to develop a workshop. And we went out to secondary schools across Connacht and Munster. So we developed an hour-long workshop to try and improve attitudes and knowledge in the hope of improving actual behaviour towards concussion. So we made it out to 9 schools in total and got to over 600 transition year students. And as part of this workshop, we recorded baseline data as well to figure out who's actually suffering from concussions in Ireland. So from the total 600 students that were taking part in the workshop, 20.1% of them have previously suffered from at least one concussion in the past. And this isn't just students that are involved in sport, this is entire transition year groups. So this is a really broad, wide-ranging group of students. Some of them don't play sport at all. Some of them are multi-sport athletes. Scarier than that again, 6% of students that took part in the workshops had suffered 2 or more concussions. And worryingly, only 2.1% have actually had any sort of concussion training or concussion education in the past. So if you can compare those numbers again, that's 1 in 50 have had some sort of concussion education in the past. but 1 in 5 have previously suffered from a concussion. So there's a real gap there that needs to be bridged. We also found that sports participation is one of the biggest indications of whether or not someone is going to suffer from a concussion. So that 11.1% there represents participants that don't take part in any sport at all. So 11.1% of students that don't take part in sport have suffered from a concussion. Compare that to students who take part in one sport, 18.5% have suffered from a concussion. And then students who take part in 2 sports, 26% have suffered from a concussion. And then students who take part in 3 or more sports, 34.1% of these students have previously suffered from a concussion. It's kind of worrying for us because there's an awful lot of multi-sport athletes in Ireland. It's really common for, let's say, a 15-year-old to go out and have Gaelic football training on a Monday evening and a Wednesday evening, then hurling training on a Tuesday and a Thursday. They'll play a soccer match on Saturday and then a Gaelic football match on a Sunday. So there are so many multi-sport athletes in Ireland, and these numbers are really worrying. Again, we're not saying the solution is to stop playing sport. We don't want to tell anyone to stop playing sport, but the solution is to try and bring up this number here of the students that are actually being exposed to concussion educational materials. And then for some individual sports, we have some data on the number of students that have suffered from concussions. So of the students taking part in Gaelic football, 31% of them have previously suffered from a concussion, and 25.2% of people playing hurling and camogie have previously suffered from it. But then when you look at our multi-sport athletes, this number goes up again. So participants playing both Gaelic football and hurling, it's 2 out of every 5 have previously suffered from a concussion. And bear in mind that these are 15, 16-year-olds. These aren't people that have been playing for 20 plus years in their lives. They're young adolescents. And then we can compare those to the numbers seen in rugby and soccer. Then for the total population that took part, again, bearing in mind this isn't just people playing rugby. I know it was highlighted earlier that the incidence in rugby for females is higher than males. But we found that in this group of adolescents, 24% of males have previously suffered from a concussion compared to 15.5% of females. But the reason why this difference exists is that more males are actively involved in sport than females. So they have more exposures to concussion than females, and that's a separate issue altogether. So females that are involved in sports had similar rates of concussions compared to males that were involved in sports. Then we just have a few take-home messages before I finish up here. So concussion education is key to improving behaviours. So I suppose a big thank you to everyone for coming today to this to improve your own knowledge on concussion, and you're helping with creating a safer environment for athletes going forward. It's really important to take the decision out of the athlete's hands. So you don't want to leave an athlete who only wants to win. You don't want to give them the decision to remain on a pitch. The coach or the parent on the sideline should be the one saying, this person should be taken off the pitch, they shouldn't be playing anymore. And then finally, concussions happen across all sports and recreational activities. It's not just a boxing issue, it's not just a rugby issue, it's a sporting issue, it's any sort of a recreational activity, it can be an issue there. Okay, so that's everything for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Keevan. That's the first time Keevan has actually had a chance to compile those data and present them. So this is, as Emma had put on the leaflet that went around, hot off the press. So thanks very much, Keevan, as well, for getting it all together for today. I think what it really highlights as well, those data, it's the first time that we've really had an in-depth analysis of adolescents' experience with concussion here in Ireland. But from all the learning, teaching, training activities that we've had with our partners as part of this project, the one thing that has become clear is some of the issues that we have in Ireland are European issues, and irrespective of the sport that people are involved in, some of the same trends and some of the same findings that we've been having here in Ireland are both European issues and global issues. And that's also helpful because anything that we develop from an education point of view can be distributed, but likewise we can also learn from other people's experiences. So the last speaker for today is another one of our researchers here in GMIT from the Irish Concussion Research Centre, Ed Daly, who's one of the lecturers on our sport and exercise science programmes and also programme lead for our Masters in Strength and Conditioning. Ed has been involved in sport all his life and was previously in professional sport working with Munster Rugby before joining us as a lecturer here at GMIT. So has had both on the field experience and also experience from a lecturing point of view and from a researching point of view. And so he's going to talk us through some of that experience today.
Hello. As Lisa mentioned, I'm part of the sport and exercise and nutrition department here in GMIT. But just to give you a bit of context, I wasn't always an academic. I wasn't always academic, full stop, but I've only come into this space in the last number of years. And as Lisa was mentioning, yeah, I was involved in coaching, and I think my overarching hat that I would wear is probably a coach. I've been involved in sport for a good number of years, for as long as I can remember, and most of that has been involved in talent identification, coaching, trying to bring younger players through. And I think that's where my interest in this topic kicked off originally. I started looking at concussion, I guess, when I was involved in those talent ID programs, because I started noticing that I was losing a lot of players for various reasons. They were stopping to turn up, or they were getting injured, or they just were being written off of squads. And to be honest with you, I kind of took that as par for the course. In my own experience, I've probably had about 6 concussions, I would say, that I would have been diagnosed with. I probably had another 6 or 8 that I just, in reflection or on reflection, recognize as concussion. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I've seen it from the coach point of view, and I've also seen it from the practical concussion perspective. So with that in mind, we started looking at some research, and we started looking at some, I guess, questions that we may look to pose in terms of finding out a little bit more about concussion. And I guess my opening remarks really are kind of resonating with what John pointed out about the Alice in Wonderland. Words mean what I want them to mean. And that is so powerful when it comes to concussion, education, management, and how we approach the topic in the next number of years. We all have tons of opinions. We all have opinions. But the problem with opinions are they're not always right. Okay? Sometimes they're partially right. Sometimes they're not right at all. And sometimes they're well wide of the mark. So what I want to try and give you this evening are just some opinions that we started out with, but now has been really informed and supported by some good research and evidence. The first piece I want to address to give you a little bit of context before I move on to the Erasmus Plus Output 1 that we formed as part of the project here are a range of interviews that we carried out with ex-professional rugby players. And that's qualitative research. So if you don't know qualitative research, it just simply means that it's non-numeric. We look at non-numeric data such as experiences, interviews, and accounts to inform some of the research that we're going to make as outputs. So we started out with this broad question, perceptions of concussion. That's what we started out with. What are the perceptions of concussion from a group of ex-professional rugby players? We carried out about 30 interviews, and for the research itself, we used about 23 of those interviews to form part of paper 1 and paper 2 and paper 3 that we're going to have outputs as part of this project. This is one. I'm not going to dwell on this. This was the first paper we put out. And we just looked at what were the perceptions of concussion and injury risk amongst professional rugby players. But the most important point, and I think the most overarching point that we found was, it was the language that they started using to describe their perceptions of concussion. That was a really important output from our point of view. In this slide, we sort of broke down the language. And how I put this slide is that this is kind of, if you were having a conversation with one of these ex-professional rugby players, how would they describe it to you? How would they put their points across? Now, a caveat to that is, I'm not saying anything out of school, as they say, because all these interviews, they're available as podcasts on our website as well, the concussioninsport.eu. So if you want to hear all those interviews, they're freely available for you. And I'm sure Lisa will give you the details as well when we wrap up. But this is the interesting language. And again, going back to John's point, words mean what I want them to mean. This point here, I didn't have any direct, say, formal concussion. I'm going to interpret that for you. What that means was, I got knocked out. I got up and I got away with it. It wasn't picked up by the medics and it wasn't picked up by the coach. That's what not having a formal concussion means. This one, I wasn't knocked out or anything. And this is a big misconception. Another little Chinese whisper that goes around. You have to be knocked out to have a concussion. That's simply not true. These ones, the adrenaline gets you through. I played on. My head was sore to touch. I wasn't knocked unconscious and I continued to play. So, this public language that I think the players used, it's almost dismissive. It's almost like, yeah, you know, I got knocked out, I got up, I continued. I'm that tough. This one here was slightly defensive from this particular player. And just remember, all these are quotes, direct quotes from the interviews we carried out. Some lads retired, but you know what? They didn't really have any long-term issues. Okay? So that's our public language that the players decided to use. As the interviews went on, and as we had more discussions, and as I kind of drilled into some of their own thoughts and the language that they started to use, they started to use what I call their private language. This is more alarming. This is the stuff that they kind of would say as the interview was coming to a close, or had their worries. You can almost look at this as short-term effects of concussion and long-term effects of concussion. Previous slide, short-term, long-term effects, this slide. They started talking about depression. They started talking about anxiety. They started talking about the trauma that was going on in their head. They started talking about the changes in themselves, the mood changes, the perceptions, what they believed was falling apart. They spoke about degradation in their memory. I just want to say that all these players retired in the last 10 years. Okay? These aren't players from the 1960s or 70s. These are players that you'll probably know that have represented your province. And interestingly, over 60% of the players we interviewed played international rugby for either Ireland, Scotland, England, or Australia. Well-established seasoned internationals. Moving on from that, and just looking at language, and words mean what you want them to mean. This is a bit that I kind of fell foul of, okay? Did anybody ever tell you something, and you heard it so frequently that you went, oh, that's true, it must be true, I've heard it so many times. It's comes a truism, or this factoid suddenly becomes reality. That was the case, in my opinion, we start talking about trying to develop neck strength and neck strength protocols as a mitigation strategy for prevention of concussion in rugby players. Hundreds of articles written around neck strength, developing neck strength, develop our posterior chain. And as you can see with the device on the right, there's lots of people who are bringing out these products to try and improve neck strength as a means of mitigating against concussion. Now, again, going back to my previous life, I was one of these. Okay, I was definitely a character who said, yeah, let's develop neck strength. Let's put a bit of, yeah, I can see it. It's going to prevent concussions, it's going to reduce it because we're going to get you stronger. Okay? But then you start looking at the evidence and you kind of go, well, what did others say? I wasn't alone because our professional rugby players said the same thing. during course of our interviews. Let's develop neck strength. Yes, let's use gum shields. Let's use scrum caps. Let's develop neck strength as, again, a means of mitigating against the effects of concussion in our game. Neck strength probably going to help against concussion. Again, all direct quotes from the interviews with the ex-professionals. This is the moment when I realized I got it wrong. Okay? That's how I felt, because I started looking for evidence. So instead of accepting something that somebody had said to me, I went and started looking for evidence. So I had an opinion, and now I wanted to back it up with evidence. And this is what we did. So we went and we did this very complicated, what is considered the highest level of evidence in research, a systematic literature review, where we trawled through, I think, over 2,700 research papers, and we came out at the end with 3 that fitted our question. And of that 3, we were trying to find out, does neck strength actually have any meaningful effect on adult populations to mitigate against concussion? No, is the answer. Okay? It does not work. There is no conclusive evidence to suggest that neck strength prevents or reduces concussion in adult populations. Little caveat to that, John alluded to it earlier on, neck strength muscles in females, younger populations, may have an effect, but all it does is it reduces your odds ratio, the risk of experiencing a concussion. There is no long-term studies to suggest that developing neck strength in any kind of population will mitigate against concussion. Okay, so at the minute, that's a hypothesis, a Chinese whisper. Okay? Next piece I want to move on to is directly related to our Erasmus Plus sports concussion and training output number 1. And again, we leaned on the highest evidence, level of evidence that we could possibly produce. And we produced this systematic literature review. Hopefully, it's going to get published in the next few months. We've had the reviewers' comments back, and they're relatively positive, and all the stress and trauma that goes with trying to get a publication out. But the point is that we started out here in the order of over 7,600 odd papers. And then we distilled all that information down to about 25. Now, the good news is, I'm not going to go through all 25 papers tonight with you, okay? But the positive is that we have produced a plain language summary, again, which is another output from our Erasmus Plus sports concussion and training program that we've ran for the last couple of years. This is going to be available to you if you want it, and I'm sure Lisa will give you details on how to access this post-conference. So it's plain language summary, does exactly what it says in the 10. It gives you all that scientific jargon and data, and we condense it down into something very readable and very accessible. I sound like Harvey Norman here, but I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to condense it down to what our main results were for the actual systematic literature review. Now, I'm not listing all of them, but we found that cognitive tests were the most used pitch side assessment tool. Now, many of these, like the Scat 5, can only be administered by a medical professional. Okay? Now, if you're working in community and amateur sport, you're starting to see where there's probably a fly in the ointment here, because many of the studies that we saw out of those 25 papers were in community or amateur sport. Problem is that most pitch side assessments require specialist training and medical attention. But the problem is that most community and amateur sports don't have access to medics. I can't tell you the amount of sidelines I've stood on and watched matches, and thankfully there was no serious injuries, but there was no medics either. That's just the nature of community and amateur sport. And I would say that's pretty common within the room itself. Conclusions to this paper. This is what we are going to conclude. We said that concussions can go undetected. And that's followed out by the fact that what Keevan was mentioning earlier on, that a lot of the people that Kevin spoke to were in this category. They went undetected, they went unknown, particularly in community and amateur sports. There is a need for better detection methods in non-elite settings. And also, the focus of our research needs to transfer to amateur and community sport, because most of the research at the minute, and again, John alluded to this at the start, is the fact that most research is happening in elite sport, but not just elite sport, elite male sports. So that does not transfer down the line. It doesn't trickle down to community sports. So that's where our focus needs to shift to. A couple of take-home messages here, because the focus of my presentation is to give you plain language. And I can't make it any plainer than this. Concussion is an injury. Concussion is an injury because when we see people hobbling into sports grounds on crutches or in a sling, or they're wearing a splint on their leg, they kind of go, oh yeah, I get it. You know, the brain says they're injured. They're clearly injured because you can see something. The problem with concussion is sometimes referred to as the invisible injury, or I'm reading a book at the minute called The Ghost in My Brain, which is an absolutely perfect depiction of what concussion is. It's in there, it's rattling around, I can't put my finger on it, I can't really explain it to people, my symptoms aren't the same as what a normal injury looks like, so it's more difficult to wrap your head around. But the take home is concussion is an injury. This is a bit of a pet hate of mine, because many of us, when we've heard descriptions of concussion previously, he's got his bell rung, okay? He's had a head bump. He's gone through the RTP protocols. He's had a head knock. The power of language that we use to describe concussion is essential. And what I mean by that is the language we use dictates how serious the injury is taken. Words mean what you want them to mean. Okay? Illustration of that was March 22nd, this went on the RTE website. It just happened to be one I picked up on. These are quotes from the head coach. Unlucky bang. Head knocks. That drives me insane. Okay? I'm sure that the IRFU and Leinster Rugby are so stringent and doing everything they possibly can to protect their players. I'm pretty sure of that. But the optics of reading this for community and amateur sports is wrong. Concussion is an injury. It is not an unlucky bang. It is not a head knock. It's an injury. And we've got to be really clear about that. We've really got to straighten and correct people on that. Plain language, plain communication. Kevin spoke about education in terms of we're not too sure what the education levels are. We know they're low. We know they're low. And it has to be repeat education time and time and time again. What I mean by that is that Kevin and myself, we ran a concussion workshop, really, for want of a better word, about a month ago with a rugby club in Limerick. And what I'm going to say in the next few sentences might shock you. You might kind of scratch your head. You might kind of go, how does that make sense? Some of the coaches told us that there was an incident with an under 15 player who was diagnosed with a concussion during a particular training session. The player left the field and then went to school about 2 days later, and his coach was wondering why he wasn't togging out to play the sport he was meant to be togging out for. To put that into context, and this is going to sound ridiculous, people don't see the injury as transferable. Now that sounds strange, but some people, we heard it that night, I've heard it uncountable times at this stage, that if I get injured playing a certain sport, I'm only injured for that sport. I'm not injured for this other sport, or I'm clear to play this other sport over here. I'm aware that sounds ridiculous, but that's what's happening. That's what's happening, okay? So what I would love to see, and this is only a proposal, and we discussed this on the night with that particular club, of trying to build a concussion communication network or an injury communication network, whatever you want to call it. But what I mean by that is that if I get injured playing a certain sport, the coach, Emma, you're the coach, you're going to tell my parent, you're also going to tell the school, you're also going to inform the other coaches of the sports that I'm playing. And keep in mind the percentage of age grade players that we know who are playing multi-sport in this country. Connectivity. How do we connect up the dots? It doesn't happen. It's not happening widely at the minute. And that's what I'd like to see. Closing off on my plain language, this line resonates with everyone. If in doubt, sit them out. I know we've kind of got a bit of fatigue from that one, but it's absolutely true and absolutely crucial. If you're not sure how to detect or how to recognize a concussion, if there's any doubt, you sit them out. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for that, Ed, and for all of the speakers. We've highlighted tonight two of the main outputs that have come from the project thus far. So firstly, a review of the evidence for how do we actually assess concussion at the pitch side, and also the beginning of the second output, which is a training guide for coaches or those of you that are involved in education. But the final output, which is currently being developed by our partners SDU, which we're all contributing to, is a module that will be readily available for all clubs, vet educators, coaches, anybody who wants it. Again, these are all free resources you can all bring into your clubs, or if you're a parent group or a school teacher or anything, these are resources that are developed as part of the project that you'll be able to utilise. And again, everything will be available off our project website. So that was the last of our presentations for the night. So now we'd like to really open this up to all of you, because this is essentially meant to be an education session, and I can see Anna moving as I speak to go grab mics. So we'd just like to open this up to the floor. A lot of information has been presented to you this evening, so any questions that you might have for the panel of speakers here, please feel free to raise your hand, and our roaming mics will go around. Oh, Anna, you're going to be right on the move, because the first question is coming from the back. Thanks, Anna.
My name is Tom. I just want to compliment the panel and the college. It's an absolutely fantastic presentation. My first question is just to John Fairclough, and it's in relation to identification of concussion. You said there was no reliable marker. Am I to understand that there is no reliable identification of concussion at a particular time early on?
Yeah. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
If you hear me. Right. The problem with concussion is that we are describing an event which has essentially symptoms. So we're saying that a person loses an ability to, for example, stand up. We measure their ataxia. This is what you saw when you saw Khan and Thomas Francis in the HIA protocol, the head injury assessment protocol. We do tests to see what kind of neurological function they have. We also have cognitive function tests, which tests the ability of the brain, if you like, to rely on information, but that's all secondary. What is actually happening is the pathology is in the brain. So when I say we cannot test for concussion, we cannot know what the pathology is in the brain, which eventually goes on to produce the problem. The Bennetamala in the United States, there's a great film. The third film I was going to mention was Concussion, which is the story of the American football, where they showed that there is if you look at the postmortems of some of the people who developed early onset dementia, they have chronic CTE, traumatic encephalopathy, where you get a certain protein. Now, that is an objective phenomenon, but obviously we cannot do postmortems on individual people who are alive. So we're looking at secondary testing. That's what I showed you with the CT scans, the MRI scans, looking perhaps at these small MRI fragments. But we do not know what the relationship with these are with the symptoms. So summarizing the answer, we at the moment use it as a qualitative test rather than a quantitative test. Ed, would you like to go through it?
Yeah, so I think there are some interesting developments, all right, in terms of trying to develop some objective markers, and that's kind of the real kind of golden egg in terms of how do we detect concussion in vivo, or how do we detect concussion while players are still alive, basically, and that's the key issue. The problem is at the minute, as John was alluding to, there's lots of hypotheses in terms of what kind of markers that could be used, but there is no definitive marker. There's some very interesting stuff around, say, blood testing, looking at eye movements, looking at all these kind of different types of tests, but there is no definitive one test that I can say, listen, this is what the test is going to be. And I think that's probably our approach to concussion in general. It is a multifactorial approach to concussion detection and also concussion management. So there's a lot of complications to it.
The vast majority of sport is non-professional, run by amateur coaches across all sports. Is the HIA really a test that a coach is capable of conducting, or if in doubt, sit him out? You're asking a lot of a coach to make an assessment on a HIA.
Yeah, sorry, can I answer that? I think you make an excellent point, and it's one that in progressive rugby we are really concerned about, because World Rugby deals with the top 1%, it's the elite game, but most of us have children, or we play, or we have grandchildren are involved in the games where there are not doctors. And that's what I was trying to allude to in my presentation, is we have to adopt a safety first attitude. I think Ed mentioned it earlier on, that we do not have the ability to actually second guess what people think. We have to educate people. We've seen it in the last 2 years with consistent messaging that people do respond, whether it's with mask wearing, social distancing, with enough persistence of message that people will respond. And with concussion, it must be that if you have any doubt there is an injury, that, let's say it's a child, that child comes off, and that child should not be playing. And we have the same problem in Wales. Sporting school has been injured for a club. It is a consistent message that concussion is a problem. It is an injury, and we must always err on the side of caution.
Can I just make two other points before I hand over, before I dominate this? Ed, you made an excellent point in relation to concussion not being transferable. And the difficulty I had was that a parent was reluctant to accept that Johnny had a concussion and now he wasn't going to be able to play hurling or rugby or whatever. And there was resistance to that who are you to decide? And the other question I want to address to Kevin, do you know your assessment in relation to children or young people and a very high level of 34% or 31% of concussion for multi-participants? Who diagnosed that? Is that children that have diagnosed their own concussion? Because I remember a couple of years ago, and I'd be coaching rugby. There was a lot of stuff about concussion, about that young fella up north who had the second concussion syndrome who died. And there was a period of about a month where everyone had concussion. So I just wonder who diagnosed that in relation to what was the foundation for your assessment in relation to your statistics? Was that medically diagnosed or was it diagnosed by the children? Thank you very much.
For that question, in the actual questionnaire itself, it was just a tick box of yes or no. So it was, they filled out the questionnaire and they said, yes, I have been previously concussed, or no, I haven't been previously concussed.
So there's no objective evidence whether they were concussed or not, because it seems really high to me. for that age group.
Again, all it was just the yes or no answer for a tick box question there.
Okay. One final question, sorry, in relation to officials. What expertise do referees have or linesmen in relation to making an assessment of a child, whether they're concussed or not? I got sent off a pitch recently enough because I was insisting that a child was concussed in the tackle. And the ref basically said, would you step outside, please? But I was really concerned for him, and I wasn't part of either team.
I might just step in on some of this, because a lot of these questions are relating to community sport, which is exactly what we're here for this evening. And just again to reiterate, there is no HIA assessment in community sports, and the go-to phrase is that if there is any doubt at all, that child, that athlete should be removed from play. We're not asking coaches to make a decision. We also, as a group, don't believe that it should be left to a coach. That's not right. We all know as well the pressures that are coming from the sideline from parents who, of course, want their child or their athlete to play. The athlete wants to stay on. But what we are saying is that people need to be educated about concussion, and if there's any doubt at all, remove the athlete from play, and then they should go for medical assessment. So that's the overriding message, I suppose, from this project. Now, there was another question just coming up there. Yeah.
I actually just wanted to make the very same point that you just made, that there is no HIA in community and amateur sport. From my perspective in rugby, that's certainly the case. As a physio, if I see any symptom or a sign of a concussion, the player is off and he's handed over to a doc or a medically qualified person. So HIA doesn't exist in community and amateur sport at all.
Thanks very much. And oh yeah, Anna, another question just there at the back. Karen has her hand up. Oh, sorry. Here first and then Karen. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you to the panel. It's been a really fascinating discussion. Just a question for Dr. Fairclough on the UK report on concussion in sport. Just on the debate between self-regulation and allowing the sporting bodies to effectively govern their own respective sports, or whether you think there should be kind of a national governmental approach to concussion in general across the board.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. The question is as to whether the government should regulate all sport. I've never been a great believer in government regulation of things in general. I think the closer you are to the sport or to the political situation, the better you are at actually judging what that restriction should be. However, World Rugby, I'm speaking from Rugby Union because that's where mainly my focus is at the moment. The governing body only covers the elite game. And the problem is that the rules in the elite game are different than they are at the lower down. My own view is that that there are specific problems that we need to deal with. You saw the kiddies. And we all laughed at the young lad running through. But there's a serious element to that. Those children were at risk. Now, in the Southern Hemisphere, they have banding of rugby. They have banding with rugby in the Southern Hemisphere, where you deal with weight and height. I'm certain that we should be looking at that in terms of the much used court university exactly the same. But the concussion protocols are not so specific. If we look at the head injury assessment, which we've all seen that incident from Francis, which gives officers a concussed, of pre-concept, of pretendism. So you're very concussed. He passed the head injury assessment. So what does that mean? It means that the head injury assessment cannot be ruled out in all cases. So going to the community stage, if we were trying to develop a protocol, who's going to do that? Who's going to make it? How are we going to do it? It has to be, and I think I've never seen on panel or my best part of unanimity of the top tonight. When in doubt, all of you have got to urge the children to sit it out, and it is the education very often of the parents. That was an excellent point. It is the parents who actually, the younger, who carry the weight
they've got to be educated. But little Johnny, who had his head injury 6 days ago, who's due to play the semi-final of football, can't play because he's at risk. Difficult start, but it is important.
Yes, I think I'm following on, and thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I'm just wondering, so in the systematic review end that you highlighted, the cognitive tests are primarily used. I think there was a paper in February that showed that even when, I think it's a case study, so obviously it's a single person, that even when cognitive tests and function was restored, there was still gait impairments, so, you know, step frequency, step asymmetry. So is that something that could potentially be built in to the assessment? And I know this is more, I'm asking for opinion, obviously evidence-based opinion, but what are your thoughts as experts in the field as to what that practical assessment should look like if, you know, the cognitive tests maybe aren't enough to monitor the actual impact, as in the example in rugby, but also the recovery then afterwards?
I think it's very difficult to say globally. I think we've got to split it down. I was really impressed with the paper, which hopefully is coming out later this year, which was brought up by a school teacher who said that the children who had concussion and had gone back playing sport 7 months later were performing less, not at the literary skills, but at maths. Now we didn't know that. I don't know anybody else has seen, but it was a new input to us. So we do have things that we can look at. It may be gait, it may be whether it's eye movements, but I noticed that there are different tests being used in different parts of the country. The problem you have is in any research, you have to have a group of individuals that you can measure. And the problem about concussion is it doesn't happen every game. And who's going to be doing the measuring? How are they going to be assessed? Who's going to see them the next time? So yes, we do need more tools, but the more complicated they are, the less likely they are to perform accurately. But I do think gait analysis is probably one of the better ones.
Just for the people that are tuning in at home, there are just some comments coming in and some questions. And just while I'm taking them, there's also just people are requesting that we use the mics just so that the people at home can actually pick up the sound. So one question that we have coming in, John, is for you again, just querying whether you feel that the current literature supports the argument that symptom resolution is an appropriate milestone for return to physical activity, both in community and elite sport.
Sorry.
Just querying whether you think that symptom resolution is an important milestone for return to physical activity.
It's certainly a milestone, but I think the important aspect, as we said, it's safety. And what we are concerned about is that there was the concussion in sport, that a lot of this has been performed by a consensus group. There have been a number of consensus studies. And unfortunately, one of the senior authors of this, a chap called McCrory, has been found to be, shall we say, having a little difficulty with his publications. He's had some of them pulled off for plagiarism. And what happened in this concussion in sports symposium is that they changed in rugby the return to play from 3 weeks down to a return to play protocol with measurements. Now, we have a problem with that, is that we do not feel that it's possible for the very severe injuries to get better in 6 days. And if they do get better with the symptoms, can that actually be reasonable when we look at the normal physiological processes? You will all have had injuries, whether there be a sprain, a bang. We know the inflammatory process takes at least 14 days to settle. I cannot believe, as a scientist, as a medic, that you can get relief in 6 days, despite the fact you get symptoms relief. So the answer to whoever's online is, I think symptoms are a useful tool, but I think we still have to be safe.
Okay, great. Thank you. Take another question here from the audience.
Thanks very much for the presentation. So this question's for Annie Trevi. Do you think the media coverage of high-profile concussions within rugby is an issue? I know with James Ryan, he's had 3 serious concussions over the last 12 months, and a lot of conversation has been Ryan's performances are dropping off. James Ryan has been concussed seriously 3 times, or even if you look at New Zealand, Bob Barrett, it's kind of the same conversation again. It's all Barrett's performances aren't what they were in 2016, 2017. No one's talking about the fact that he's had serious concussions in high-profile games.
It's really relevant. Excellent question, because the follow-on from that comment from the Barrett's head coach was that the worst he's going to experience is a mangled face. That's what his quote was after Bowen Barrett was replaced at the weekend after another rugby incident that happened during a Super Rugby game. So to answer your question, there is a massive burden on media to report accurately. And what I mean by that is they will report the mechanism of concussion and they won't report the injury. So there's a subtle difference there. So they'll say that person received a massive impact. They won't discuss the fact that the player is injured or that he is concussed or address concussion as an injury. So to circle back around, there is a massive onus on the media, as I kind of pointed out in the article from the RTE website. We have to start addressing it and recognising the fact that it is an injury. It is a true injury and not something that can be explained away as they're going through the protocols. It's a head bump, or that player is very durable, which is another soundbite that tends to come out from media. So I think they have a massive responsibility to report accurately.
Do you think it'll take managers to be like more open, to be honest, and say, oh, you know what, James Ryan isn't okay after that, rather than giving like typical answer, he's going through protocols, doctors with him now?
I think the problem is if any of you watch the national press, certainly if you've seen any of the Welsh press, when I suggested that with Brian O'Driscoll's namesake on progressive rugby, Barry O'Driscoll with us, we suggested that it was dangerous to allow Tom Francis to go back at 6 days because he was concussed. That we got pilloried in the press. Pivot suggested that perhaps we were not neurosurgeons. And you do get a lot of kickback when you are suggesting that international players should not go back and play if they're important matches. It is very difficult, and it's difficult for you, if you're coaches, if you're physiotherapists, if you're doctors, to suggest that a player might not be able to play in an important match. So it's something that we have to all be alert. It's, again, we're going round in a circle. It's education and play safe.
Yeah, I just reiterate that. I just to close off on it, I think the most retrograde step we took was reducing the return to play for professional sport. So I just don't think it's feasible for an injury to recover that quickly. And I think a lot of that is driven by how it's reported, how it's discussed, or how it's not discussed, for that matter. So I think there is an onus to report accurately and be very, very, very clear that it is an injury and not something that you can just be dismissive about. It's okay in the short term, but not in the long term. And again, I would reiterate that I think the IRFU, Leinster Rugby, are probably doing everything they can to protect the player, but it's a complicated conversation that we're not privy to.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much. There's one question coming here, if we have a mic, and then if you have one burning question after that, we'll take one more, and then I'll be bringing this evening to a close, just conscious of time. Yeah, Rebecca, just here. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the really interesting talks. I'm just wondering, getting back to the community side, I'm thinking of an analogy, and it's a very poor one, but 10, 15 years ago, there was no such thing as child protection training. And now it's absolutely mandatory across all sports. If you're getting involved at all, you have to do your foundation training, and as part of that, you're doing child protection. Do you think the end point here is that in another few years, concussion training will be part of the basic training for the most relevant sports?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. Having seen it from the inside out, having been, working in that realm for quite a good number of years, we have to see it more than a tick box exercise. And the key to concussion education is repetition. What Keevan found out during his research was that we have what's known as our declarative knowledge, stuff that we say, yeah, concussion is bad, concussion is an injury, we need to treat it really seriously, we need to take the player off the field. And then we compare that to our procedural knowledge, which simply means that I won't do that. I might say it, but I won't do it. How we reinforce that, and what Kevin has found out, and what I would say from my own experience, is that it has to become mandatory, but it has to become repetitive as well. It's got to be repeated consistently throughout a season for all sports. This isn't just a rugby issue. It's across all our major sports that we have here in the country. It's not integral enough to answer your question.
But do you think the sporting bodies will inevitably end up at that point, because it ends up being driven by the...
Yeah, I agree, and I think it has to, because now we're way more conscious of the fact that it is an injury and that it is more prevalent, and because we are now detecting it a little bit better, or we're willing to admit that it's more of an issue. So I do think that we have to try and, we've discussed this a number of times in terms of how do we try and look at what the state of concussion is amongst all our national governing bodies here in the country. And a lot of them are very similar because they've all used each other's guidelines, is the best way to put it to you, which needs to be more specific to what their own sports are. So I do think it needs to be kind of a standalone, as you say, almost like this is our coaching module, and then built into that needs to be some sort of a distinct module about concussion. Going back to the speakers or the person who asked the question at the back, the job isn't to assess and diagnose. The job is just to merely go, yes, I suspect there is a concussion here in this game, and that's all it has to be. So if you just kind of have an idea of what the signs and symptoms are able to put those together, then that's your job. Then it's over to the medics. It's over to people who are more qualified. But it needs to be a module within our national governing bodies.
Okay, thanks very much for that question, Des. Any further burning question? Okay, final question of the day. No, that's no problem.
Thank you, everyone. That was wonderful. I, myself, and my colleague here, Gavin, we're minis and underage youth rugby coaches. Des, in relation to the head injury assessment concussion, that is now part of Connacht Rugby's training programme. All new coaches have to have that. I do agree it needs to be repetitive. I don't know what the plan is for that. My query is, Kevin, based on your research, how young was your graphic aimed at? Was your questionnaire only at TY? Like, how young should we be teaching the kids themselves, and not just their parents, as to how to mind themselves after a suspected head injury?
I suppose it's more so, it's a bigger question than concussion there when they're that age. When they're that age, all they want to do is go out and play. It's the same as if they have a hamstring injury, they're going to be of the opinion, if I can keep playing here, I'm going to keep playing. But it's really trying to just get across the message of the seriousness of a concussion compared to a hamstring injury, where a hamstring injury might stop you from playing sport. A concussion might stop you from being able to have a conversation with your friends, to watch TikTok on your phone, to do simple things like this. Like a concussion can affect every single facet of your life, whereas a hamstring injury, the biggest issue that a child is going to have is being able to go back to playing sport and playing outside with their friends. That's kind of my thoughts on it.
I think just to add to that, the key component there is how willing again pointed out at the back, how willing the parents and coaches and guardians, and that connectivity between everybody speaking, how connected they are. Because even with adult grade sport, you take the decision out of the players' hands. That's what we found, and even with the research we found with the ex-professional players, they didn't want the decision in their hands. So hypothetically, I'm very familiar with mini rugby. It's more like child minding and herding sheep as opposed to playing the sport. But it's great crack. But the point is, you take the decision out of their hands. You as a coach are just going, yeah, I understand. I think this person did take some sort of an impact. They're not feeling great, and you're able to spot a couple of signs and symptoms. You know, sometimes it could be just disorientated, not the obvious ones. It could be just not themselves, or they could have gotten sick or something. So all those things are just things you detect as a coach. Get them to sit it out, you observe them, get on the phone to mom, dad, guardian, whoever it is, and then that's the chain starts from there. So it's not so much directed, the education isn't directed at the child at that particular point, it's at the people who are kind of minding them.
Thanks very much for that final question, and I'm just going to, in the interest of time, bring the Q&A to a close, but thank you everybody for your contributions. I would like to finish by just highlighting one of the points that John made. The thing about concussion that we do know is that the majority of people recover, and they recover within a defined period. The whole purpose of this project and this evening is actually just to create an awareness around concussion and use these educational tools as a platform for discussion either with the parents, the athletes, or the other coaches that you're interacting with. Once we have a conversation about it, once we're all educated about it, then people can speak up and reinforce that if in doubt, sit it out message, which is really what this whole group is about. I'd just like to thank our partners on the project as well, Letterkenny, IT, who will soon be joining us, GMIT along with IT Sligo to become the Atlantic Technological University, and then our international partners, ICHIRF, Oxford Brookes University, SDU, Southern Denmark University, and then also Trobe University in Australia. From my own point of view, I'd firstly like to thank my own head of school, Dr. Des Foley, for all his support, both for our new department in sport, exercise and nutrition, but also more generally for the development of sport and exercise and nutrition here at GMIT. But there's a huge team that has been involved here into tonight's event. Firstly, our IT, who have been very patient with us because this is our first as a group large hybrid event. We've had a number of people interacting online, and thank you everybody that joined us online. But we also have a number of placement students that are working with us. Anna, who's been roaming with the mic, Rebecca, Emer, Michaela, loads of different people who have been around helping us throughout the night. And also the direct team from GMIT's perspective that are involved in this Scat project. So Emma Judge, who has now dropped down at the back out of sight, Maria McDonough, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us this evening, Ed and Kevin, who you've heard from. But the person who has probably helped the most with the development this evening, who you have all heard from, I'm sure, she is a Twitter and Instagram fiend. She's fantastic on social media and does communications across actually all of our European projects. Emma Finnegan, who is sitting slightly out of sight beside me here, just from all of us, I'd like to thank her because tonight really wouldn't have happened without her. She's done so much work in the background to get us here today, keep us all on track, and make sure that the event ran so smoothly. And she certainly would have been the person that contacted all of you and ensured that you had the information to come here for this evening's event. So from my own point of view, I'd just like to send a real heartfelt thanks to Emma for all the organisation of tonight's event. So thank you very much, Emma. And of course, we wouldn't have the night at all if you all hadn't registered for the event and come and joined us. We've also had involvement from Minimi and other groups. You know, you've all got your packs. I hope you've all had a chance to look at them. There will be a number of different events as part of this Erasmus Plus funded project. So again, please keep a track on our social media channels and also our website for further updates. But it is a Tuesday evening. We're very grateful for you both either joining us online or making the effort to attend this evening. So thank you so much for all of you coming here tonight.